nobody attended for a while. We all went home, and Neil preached to us on the internet. So glad to get back to. Now I've been back about 2 or 3 months, and glad to get back to some semblance of normalcy. Got my second shot Friday, and I'm still standing up. So thanks to Ruth, she gave me some hint on what to do when I got home. So I did that, and it didn't feel anything that I know of. Arm's a little sore, but I think that was more how the guy gave it at Publix. Chomp. He's hadn't done that very often. But just a brief background as to why this topic, why certainly the topic is consistent with the congregation's effort for all of us to become more passionate followers of Jesus Christ. There's nothing more that I can think of that kind of reflects that than the whole topic of commitment. But why this particular book? I'm using a book. Sometimes it's available on the internet. Sometimes it's not these days. It's out of print, I think. But it's a book that was written by Prentice Metter Jr. called Promises to Keep. And just a brief background. I got to know Prentice when I was in elementary school. His mother was my 4th grade teacher. My dad went back, as I mentioned when I taught the last time, my dad went back to college when he was in his early 30s to Lipscomb to learn how to preach. He'd been preaching since he was 15, but he decided he wanted to go back and learn how to do it right. So he went back to Lipscomb when he was in his early 30s. I went to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade at Lipscomb. And in the 4th grade, I had a teacher. Her name was Mrs. Metter, Mrs. Prentice Metter. Probably one of the most demanding teachers I think I ever had. Didn't like her at all. But in years past, I came to appreciate that woman probably more than any teacher I ever had. She would have monthly meetings with my parents. That was just unheard of during that day and time. And making sure I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. And I thought, how terrible of her to do that. But she was a wonderful person, and I came back to college, attended church at Hillsborough Church of Christ when I was in college at Lipscomb, and her husband was an elder there, Prentice Metter Sr., worked for the post office, but he was an elder and really a confidant of Batzel Barrett Baxter, who was the minister at Hillsborough at that time. Those two had a great relationship, but Prentice Metter Sr., Jr. Was his and Mrs. Metter's son, Linda, their daughter. I've known the whole family all my life. Of course, the Metters have passed away. Prentice passed away in 2008. He was, for years, was a professor at UCLA. Was the senior minister at the Preston Crest Church of Christ in Dallas, Texas for a number of years. And I think when he passed away was the minister of a large congregation in Columbia, Missouri. I'm not exactly sure, kind of lost touch of his final years, but passed away at a relatively early age, 60s, I think. Good thinker. A very good thinker, and probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know why, but I was in Nashville and doing something and went by a bookstore and picked up this book, and I thought, well, it's Prentice, I'll read that book. I hadn't seen the book, and started reading it, and then I thought, oh, this would be great. So I used it for our small group work at Highland View Congregation in Oak Ridge. Finally used another book that he wrote. Forget the name of that one. But I always appreciated Prentice and his thinking. He had a way of taking concepts and applying them to what we deal with today better than most ministers I know. So again, if you have a chance, Promises to Keep, Prentice Metter. I'm going to summarize each chapter and give you a handout. So you don't need to. I don't think you need to purchase the book, but you might want to kind of make some notes as we go through that. I've changed the names of some of the chapters and added some of my stuff and deleted a lot of his stuff to kind of get it into the 45 minutes that we have. But so I started today, and this is the title of the first chapter of his book, called Semper Fi, or Semper Fidelis. The meaning, was anybody in the room a Marine? Anybody know what that means? Always faithful. One of my favorite shows on television is NCIS. so Gibbs, the star of NCIS on Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock, he was a Marine, gunny sergeant, I think. That word has come up in that program. It's come up in our popular culture through the years. In Washington, there is a statue of a group of Marines raising a flag on a mountain in Iwo Jima. And at the base of that monument are the words Semper Fidelis. Semper Fidelis. And I've kind of put here kind of what I think the meaning of that is, and kind of some of the words are at the bottom of that monument. It says, an eternal and collective commitment to the success of our battles, the progress of our nation, and the steadfast loyalty to the fellow Marines we fight alongside. That's at the base of that monument in Washington. That's probably one of the best known images of World War II. Seeing that group of Marines raise the American flag at the top of Mount Suramachi on Iwo Jima. 6,000 people died that day. 6,000 Americans died those few days of that battle of Iwo Jima. But we had to take that because that was 750 miles from Tokyo, and that was a stopping off point for planes to refuel so they could go and bomb Tokyo at the time. But always faithful. So that phrase carries a context. It carries a meaning to us, which is not unlike a lot of phrases. If I were to say, like a rock, what product does that bring to mind? Chevrolet? Okay. What does the real thing bring to mind? Coca-Cola. What are some other phrases that marketers have attached to products? Pardon? Just do it. Who's that? Nike. Now they've just got the swish. Yeah. But I think one of the things that captures what I'm trying to say here is the statement of Pizza Hut has on some of their literature around their corporation. PepsiCo, I think, owns Pizza Hut now. It says their vision is, on every pizza occasion, the American family will think of Pizza Hut. They won't necessarily buy Pizza Hut all the time, but the vision of the company is that on every, and I think these phrases, these catch lines, these taglines are things that are supposed to bring something to mind for us. And so Semper Fidelis, Semper Fi, brings to mind the concept of always faithful. And I don't think there's anything that you can attach to commitment more than always faithful. There's nothing that Jesus wanted any more than for us to be always faithful. And so that I think is something that comes out loud and clear in the Bible. There are vows and promises that people have made, and to keep those promises, be always faithful to those, is something that's essential. So God made a promise to Abraham. What was that? Absolutely. Did he keep that promise? Sure he did. What kind of promise did God make to Isaac? Who were Isaac's two kids? Jacob and Esau. So, Isaac was going to bless them. Kind of got a little confusing there because one of them jumped in front of the other one, but he was going to bless them and make great nations of them. He made promises to Jacob through Isaac's blessings. He made promises to us. So there's promises that are made throughout the New Testament, throughout the Bible. And those promises are always revealed. They're always fulfilled. And I think that's what commitment is. When we make promises, we commit, we fulfill to do the things that we promise to do. So let's talk a little bit today about what is commitment. If you're going to define commitment, how would you define it? Steadfastness, okay. Dedicated. Trustworthy. Sacrifice. There's a lot of words that you could put to that. When you see it in practice, if I were looking at and I'm not going through my slides here, sorry. If I were going to look at how commitment is demonstrated in our lives, I've seen people who care for elderly parents. My dad passed away at 96 and my mom at 97. Until he passed away, she took care of him. But when he passed away, she was in her early 90s at the time, and I thought, this is time for me to repay what she did for me all the time I was growing up. Yes, Sean?
A form of love. To me, I've never seen anyone that has been committed to something or someone without loving it or someone. So,
if there's no love for it, no caring for it, why would you commit to it? Yeah, exactly. And so, it took a lot of time. I lived about 80 miles away, so at least once, sometimes twice a week, I made the trip from Oak Ridge to Sparta to check on her. Sometimes most of the time, found everything great and everything's fine. There were times I got there, things weren't fine. And it took some time to care for the, I think I did what I should. Could I have done more? I think so. She was always saying, no, you don't need to come over here. You don't need to help me. You don't need to do that. I can take care of this. But still, I don't think I have a sense of guilt, but when I look back on it, I think, I probably could have done more. But when you care for elderly parents, that takes a commitment. And you do it because you love them. What about your children? Rearing children. Does that take a commitment? How much time do you spend in taking care of them physically? Now, parents are taking care of them educationally. They're having school at home in a lot of cases. My grandsons are still going to school from home. Ball games, recitals, the time and effort it takes. I remember a time when my older daughter went through Girl Scouts, and I was there for all the stuff, and then I happened to be in Atlanta for a conference when my younger daughter was going to be inducted into the Girl Scouts. And it was going to happen at 7 o'clock one night, and I'm sitting in a meeting in Atlanta about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I thought, if I slip out of here, 3 hours and a half, I can be at that thing. I can be at that. So I floorboarded that car up I-75, and I got there got to the induction ceremony, saw her, and I don't think she's ever been any happier because she thought I wasn't going to be there. I was there for her sisters, but I wasn't going to be there for hers. And so I was really happy I did that. It made me feel good, but I think it made her feel good that I was there. So you do those types of things. I didn't think of it as a obligation. I wanted to be there because I loved her. How about good marriage? Does that take a commitment? I have a friend who's an attorney in Tennessee that met through a Chamber of Commerce function, and I asked him what his specialty was in the legal world. He says, well, I specialize in starter marriages. I said, what's that? He said, everybody gets a divorce after 2 or 3 years now. Oh, wow. What a lack of commitment there is demonstrated when I think at this point in time, 1 out of every 2 marriages end in divorce. And commitment is required in those types of relationships. Valued employees. This is something I've dealt with for the last 30 years, working with companies to try to engage their employees in the workforce, that are in the workforce. That's a difficult and an ongoing task. I had an instance one time where I was talking to an HR manager that worked for an engineering company, had about 200-300 employees, and he was frustrated. Said he just lost one of his engineers. And I said, well, couldn't you compete salary-wise? He said, well, he was going down the street to work for another engineering company. They were going to pay him another, $2 a week. And I said, really? He said, yeah. He said he was losing some of his health insurance. He was losing some of his retirement stuff. He was going to get far less at that place, new place. And I asked him about that. He said, well, you can't eat that stuff. Good grief, $2 a week. We're going to talk about that a little more in a few weeks. But how do you measure a valued employee? Are they there on time? Do they focus on their work? Do they relate to other employees well? Do they have a good product? Is it quality work? So many programs we've had to put in place through the years you hire somebody, you think they're going to do a job, and they don't. Talked to somebody one day, and I was in Knoxville for some sort of meeting and saw somebody. I said, what? You're not at work today? No, I'm taking a mental health day. Have you heard that? I said, what's that? Well, I needed to do some Christmas shopping. I said, okay. That was foreign to me. I mean, when my dad taught me years ago, when you go to work, you get there ahead of time, you stay late, and so all the time that I ran my own company, we started at 8 and closed at 5, but I was never there after 7 o'clock, and always there till 6 or after. And I don't know. You just don't have that commitment to work today like we used to. How about neighbors? I've had neighbors that come over and, hey, Stacy, can I borrow an electric cord? Can I borrow this tool? Can I borrow that? Yeah. And you never see it again. Never comes back. I got to the point with one guy that if you do not want it back, don't lend it to him, because you knew it wasn't coming back. Neighborhoods are kind of tough places. I hope I don't spend much time talking about this, but last week I was elected president of our HOA. I may regret that. We have about 900 homes and 3,000 something residents in Wilderness Lakes up north on 41. And this week I've already gotten 2 or 3 letters, nasty letters, of people complaining about their neighbors. One of them is they leave their car across the sidewalk. I mean, this is not just, hey, could you mind reminding people to move their cars off. No, this was a 2-page letter railing against the violations of just parking the car in the wrong place. Another one I got had to do with feeding wildlife. So they're feeding the deer that come in their backyard, and now they're getting feral hogs, feral cats. I mean, the whole backyard's become a zoo, and it's getting into people's gardens, and so I may wish I hadn't done that. But being a good neighbor, when I moved into that neighborhood, they gave me the declaration of a deeded community, and I read it and I signed it. I made a commitment to live by those regulations. Good. Yes, sir.
It's on TV where they're working in their yard, and the head of the Homeowners Association comes by, takes a power saw, cuts their mailbox off, and says, "You're 6 inches over height." And then she comes to the house and cuts off all the potted plants hanging there, and says, "You're not supposed to have this hanging from your house." And all they do is they say, "Good morning, Miss So-and-so," and the other guy says, "Well, I see you've met our homeowners."
That's right. That wouldn't be funny unless there was some truth to it.
Oh, that's what's really funny about it.
Yeah. There is some truth to that. I mean,
a young kid who could only afford his first vehicle, and it would leak some oil. It was a diesel. It was an old one. And the Homeowners Association was on them real bad because they were leaking some oil on their driveway. And he couldn't park it off on the driveway any place. It was comical, actually.
that's one of the regulations that I signed up, that I'll keep my driveway clean from stains. Right.
If you haven't gotten it already, make sure to tell your homeowner not to feed the sand trains because they have a memory and they'll come back and just aggravate you to death.
Okay, all right. I'll do that. Well, we had one. I bet the people who lived in our house before that, because last year we had one that came pecked on the window all the time. I thought, why is that stupid thing doing that? So a lot of things require commitment. So let's look at certainly some similar words that kind of pop up when move it forward one more slide, that kind of are foreign to us today. I think of the classes I had when I was growing up as a kid. It wasn't unusual to hear some of these words talked about, and certainly you got a grade on deportment at the end of each grading period. That's usually my worst grade, but nonetheless, you got a grade on deportment. And some of these words were kind of used as you talked about behavior, as you talked about relationships with the teacher and with the other students in the class. But you don't see that anymore. Mentioned I had a little company in Tennessee for years, and I had a guy come to me several years ago, and he said, "We'd like for your company to sponsor a new and innovative program and we're going to introduce into the school system." And I said, "Well, what's that?" "It is a program called Character Counts." And I went, "You don't already teach that?" It was a good program. I'm not criticizing the program. But I thought, wow, what's happened to the educational world that's no longer is a part of the education. We're all about STEM now: science, technology, engineering, and math. But those human relationships with each other, the communication, how you deal with conflict, how you relate to each other, those are not part of what we teach in the educational system. These words are no longer in our educational system. So let's look kind of for a few minutes here. I'm going to give you a little test here. There are 3 examples that kind of introduce, I think, what the elements of commitment are. There are three stories in the Bible that I think do a good job in kind of getting that to us. The first one is the story of Esther. Somebody tell me about Esther. Tell me that story. What did Esther do?
Became queen.
Became queen, okay?
She, through her courage, went before the king, uninvited, you might say, and saved her people.
Okay. So why did she save them? Save them from what?
They were going to kill this, the other guy who was stirring it up.
Haman.
He got permission to kill all the Jews. He even built a hangman's rack, I think, and ended up using it himself.
So Haman's gone to the king, says, everybody who's different than us, that doesn't do things the way we do, let's kill them. King says, okay, sounds like a good idea to me. So they start killing their slaves. And the children of Israel were slaves at that time. But before all that happened, Esther had found favor in the king's eyes. She had become his queen. But I guess the relationship wasn't all warm and fuzzy because she was afraid to go to him and say anything about this. Her people were being killed. And so she's told that you need to go to the king and you need to talk to the king. I don't know about that. So they have this conversation, and she comes up with this phrase that I think is kind of interesting. The phrase was, if I perish, I perish. So she's fully expecting, and you can find this in Esther, the 4th chapter, I think. Esther, the 4th chapter, the phrase, if I perish, I perish. So she goes to the king, and the king's alarmed at what she tells him. And so instead of killing the slaves, he kills Haman because he brought this suggestion to him, and had kind of played the king for a fool, and so Haman paid with his life. So that to me is one characteristic of commitment, is loyalty. You can make a commitment to Jesus Christ. You can be baptized. You can become a Christian. But for anyone who's sitting here, there's 100 others who've done that, and they're no longer here. Something else has become important. Something else has gotten their attention. It's diverted their loyalty, if you will, to something else. So I think, yes, go ahead.
Stacy, it's interesting also about this dude Mordecai. He heard it, he went to the queen, and he relayed the information, and certainly that was worthy of quick recognition. Hallelujah, look what Mordecai did. I think where we go wrong, though, is on the other side of that, Mordecai got no recognition at all.
No.
Until what? Later.
Yeah.
But Mordecai lived off of his integrity.
Uh-huh.
He knew he had done the right thing.
Yeah.
And so I think where we missed the boat right now is a lot of it is instant gratification.
Yeah.
I did good. Give me my reward.
Yes.
And that's where we mess up sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I've got a grandson that believes that in spades. I mean, he can be the worst kid, 9 years old. He can be the absolute worst kid that you can imagine all day long. And you get toward the end of the day, and his mother will say, Elijah, clean that mess up. And he'll clean it up. And, what do I get for that? Can I have ice cream? You can't have anything.
I believe that Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God.
I wasn't aware of that.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yes.
But she asked for her people to pray about it when she was waiting to go before the king.
Yes. Yes, she did. She was very nervous about going to him, wasn't she?
The other thing about Esther, I think the king is one of the same kings or related to one that Daniel had to deal with.
Daniel's our next example.
I'm not sure exactly what the
It was about the same time frame. I think the king was Xerxes or something.
name matches one of the kings that Daniel had to deal with, I believe.
My memory serves me correct. Yes.
That when you put the phrase up there, if I perish, I perish. Right? We had a friend who passed away just a couple of weeks ago, and at the end, you know, he was to the point he knew he was terminal, but they could have brought in some extreme treatments or whatever, but he was so at peace with God and so ready to meet his maker that he basically, you know, if I perish, I'm ready to go, I'm ready to be there. And I've seen that in several cases, and it just reminded me of that, the loyalty we have to our Lord, that we're ready to meet him when that time comes, we can have that peace in our hearts.
You know, as I get older, I think about that. How will I approach the last few minutes of my life? Now I feel like, well, it's got to be in a panic. There's so many things I didn't do I should have done, or some things I did I shouldn't have done. You know, how can I clean all that up? But that you're right. Prentice uses an example in the book in this chapter of a woman that in a congregation where he preached that did that very same thing. And he went to her in the hospital, and she knew she was on her last few minutes of her life. And he said, you know, there's a lot of things I want to tell people about you when at the funeral. He said, you're such a wonderful. He said, no. He said, I don't want anybody to hear anything that I've ever done. I just want you to tell people that I love God. He was the most important thing in my life. That's it. Whatever you say can be about anybody else and other things, but that's all I want you to say about me. And I thought, wow, that's impressive. Sometimes we want plaques. We want testimonials in the newspaper and magazines and by whoever does our obituary. But that's a remarkable approach to life. I just want you to tell people how much I love God. Yes, sir.
This hasn't happened yet. I'm going to ask you. But I believe it's going to happen. What are we going to do when they say that this culture we have going on now, that parts of the Bible we need to erase because they're prejudiced, or they just don't like, or the whole Bible, or the whole New Testament? What are we going to do to counteract this? Because I think it's coming.
We're going to talk about culture in a couple of weeks, and one of the cultures we're going to talk about is what I call the woke culture. Ideally, people say, well, that's the individuals who have awakened to this new realization of we've done a lot of things wrong in our life. We need to erase all that. We're going to come back and talk about that. That's a good point.
Because it's just like these Dr. Seuss books. Well, if you don't like it, don't read them. You know, they're not going to tell me what to do or what to read. They're just not going to. Because I don't know about the rest of the folks, but I plant my right foot down, I'm ready to fight.
When I was a professor at university up in Illinois years ago, there was a group of people who, I forget the name of the book, there was some book that was popular at that time about how difficult it was for young kids who were getting involved in drugs. And they were going to take that out of the library. And as a professor, I went down and sat in on the board who dealt with that sort of stuff. And I said, are you really going to do this? I mean, that's one of the worst things that can happen to a young person is to get addicted to something like that. And this in detail laid out the anguish that families feel, the unseemly things that happen in that young girl's life because she was addicted to those drugs, and they wanted to take it out. No, we don't. Our kids don't need to read this. I said every kid needs to read this. to see what it does to your life. And if you don't, then you're condemned to repeating those mistakes over and over again because you didn't learn from it the first time. Yes, sir.
Now, I tried to help some family member, and I didn't realize why they didn't want that help. They struggle with money, terrible. And I often tried to get them into the trades, building trades that I'm in. And they wouldn't do it, And I just threw my hands up, and there's nothing I could do to help him if he won't better himself.
Yeah.
And my son, who's in the trades, not Terry here, my other son, Chris, he says, "Dad, don't you know why?" I looked at him, I said, "Well, I think I do. What is it? What do you say?" He says, "He likes to smoke grass, and he's got to pass a drug test to be into the construction
Yeah.
trades. You can have to take a random drug test at any time." And so, what you're saying right there are consequences, and they may not be horrific consequences like leading into other illegal stuff, but just the fact that you don't want to quit it, and that you're not going to better your family and your position,
Yeah.
and provide for your family because you like to smoke grass.
Yeah, in a very similar situation, several years ago, I was asked by a company to design a selection system, recruit, interview, hiring people. They had about 1,000 people at that time. They were going to hire another 300 or 400 people. I said, "Can you help us design a selection system that'll get those people?" And I said, "Yeah." So I put a selection system together, and the last step in that selection system before the job offer was a drug screen. They said, No, we can't do that." I said, "Why? If we do that, half of our employees won't show up for work." I thought, wow. So the issue is loyalty to something. What are we committed to? What are we loyal to? So the second example I'll look at, and we're about out of time here, and I knew I'd do this. Daniel. Quickly tell me about Daniel.
He's loyal to God.
Okay. How do you demonstrate that?
Because when he was threatened that he had to bow down to a golden image, he still prayed to God.
Okay. Can't pray. Don't pray anymore. But immediately goes to his room, looks to the east, gets on his knees, and prays as he did. And I think the scripture says as he did every day. He had integrity. He didn't change just because somebody said you need to change. Right.
He knew that. He knew that his friends was going to betray him, even though he knew what the king had done and that it was a setup. And yet his loyalty to God carried him through all that.
Yes, absolutely. So he had integrity. And the third one, Stephen. Tragic story. Well, what was Stephen's story? What happened there?
He taught the most thorough Bible lesson that you can read from beginning to end.
By what?
To the Jews and about Christ.
Okay.
They stoned him.
And they stoned him. And what did he say when they were stoning him?
Don't hold this sin
Don't
against
hold this sin against them. So that's a sacrifice. So the elements I think that really make up commitment are loyalty, integrity, and sacrifice. Words that we don't hear a lot anymore. But certainly when it comes time to being a Christian, we need to hear them. Because that same sacrifice that Stephen made was made later by who? Paul?
Peter.
Yeah, 11 of the 12 apostles died a violent death. And of course, ultimately, Jesus is crucified. So that pattern repeated itself time and time again. And those folks who died those violent deaths had loyalty, they had integrity, and they were willing to sacrifice. Sure.
You were talking about the code a while ago. It reminded me that the military had a code of conduct that we had to adhere to when I was in the service. And I think that that's been watered down to some extent because of the things you see that people are doing in the military and getting away with it, it seems like to me.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, but I think probably some of the greatest, most notable, if you will, issues that have arisen in the military in recent years have been occasionally you'll have something which pops up at one of the academies where there's been cheating on tests or something like that. And I'm glad that still becomes a newsworthy item. That's not expected because that code of conduct is there to start with. Let me finish with a couple of quotations. One of the books, I've got several books that I enjoy reading, but one of them, several of them are written by C.S. Lewis. So you kind of got to read C.S. Lewis's books realizing that he wrote these books during World War II as a resident of England while bombs were falling all over his house and he was battling the issues related to Nazism. But he wrote a book called Mere Christianity. And I put a little quotation in your handout. It says, as an excerpt from that book, it says, "Give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I have not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here and a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. Hand over the whole natural self, all the desires which you think innocent, as well as the ones which you think wicked. The whole outfit. I'll give you a new self instead. In fact, I will give you myself. My own shall become yours." And then I'll have some other quotes from some of his books in next few lessons. But to me, that kind of encapsulates what commitment's all about. There's a song that came out in 1939, or written in 1939. It became popular years later. It was sung by Frank Sinatra, but it was a song called "All or Nothing at All," which I think kind of captures what Christianity is all about. Christ wants all of us. A commitment of everything we have is His, now belongs to Him. But that kind of interesting popular song that kind of captures what commitment's all about. And then the last thing I'll read, and we are out of time, is from Prentice's book. There's a quotation here from Elton Trueblood, theologian from 1980s, 1990s, who kind of said, "A Christian is a person who confesses that, amidst the manifold and confusing voices heard in the world, there is one voice which supremely wins his full assent, uniting all his powers, intellectual and emotional, into a single pattern of self-giving. That voice is Jesus Christ. A Christian not only believes that he believes in Him with all his heart and strength and mind. Christ appears to the Christian as the one stable point or fulcrum in all the relativities of history. Once the Christian has made this primary commitment, he still has the perplexities, but he begins to know the joy of being used for a mighty purpose, by which his life is dignified." So this kind of introduces our topic of commitment. We're going to look at a whole bunch of different stuff around this whole issue of commitment. Next week, for those of you who enjoy basketball, the title of the lesson is March Madness. So the first question is going to be, why is next week March Madness? So see if you can come up with the answer to that this week. Thank you.